first of all thank Cobus for inviting me to. Hi, I'm Michael Tanaka, Chief Commercial Officer for MIRACL. And I'd first of all like to thank Cobus for inviting me to NetShare 2023. The title of the talk, which I'm sure you've seen before or seen already, is Single Step Multi-factor Authentication, Does Time and Success Matter? Now, hopefully I'll be able to complete sort of, I should say, sort of commercial sort of push for my own product. But the idea and some of the concepts here can obviously be applied to many different things. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So, of course, first question is there are a lot of challenges in authentication, and they really go beyond just simply passwords and in multi-factor. And a lot of these things, of course, can be applied to every situation. Currently, of course, customers are more and more mobile. Anything which obviously causes friction is a reason for them to leave or to go to other places. In the enterprise, every second counts, and it's surprising actually how much just a 30-second authentication can add up if you do it more than a couple times in the day. And there are a lot of other sort of issues with adoption of many of these sort of different forms of authentication, one of which is that they become really heavily reliant on mobile phones. But as an example, in around 2019, Google found that around 38% of people don't have their mobile phone present when they're asked to authenticate. And actually, by choice, if you ask people, the vast majority of people would choose not to use multi-factor authentication at all. If you actually look at some typical situations, actually, as an example, in the gaming world, where oftentimes multi-factor is mandated, you'll see a take-up of no more than 2 to 4%. So clearly the consumers are also voting with their feet for various different reasons. And then the other angle is, of course, those consumers are very impatient. So we did actually talk about how they would actually happily leave and go somewhere else. But also, of course, what it does, it really directly impacts your conversion. And we're seeing here as an example, a 1 second delay in loading, or in other words, getting to the next step can hit your conversion by up to 20%. Then you have the obvious things that obviously are hitting us as well, the security issues, the regulatory issues, and various things like that. And of course, we know that passwords are definitely not the solution to all of these things. In fact, actually, they are the #1 cause of all major security breaches out there. And in some instances, we're talking about 80 to 85%. And these sort of headline numbers, I'm sure you've seen many times. As an example, in the enterprise, around 40% of all help desk calls are to do with things like password resets. And on average, it's 12 minutes, but we've seen as high as 20 minutes to do a password reset. And given the rather low volume sort of numbers that we're talking about, it's unsurprisingly a very high cost per sort of support request, sometimes around $70 per request. In the consumer space, it's actually amazingly a lot quicker to do resets. Of course, a lot more time is spent on making it easy for the consumer to do that reset themselves without the help of that support. But what happens, of course, is you find that the consumers are having to reset very, very frequently to the effect that actually wasting around 12 hours per year resetting passwords. And what does that do? Well, when it comes down to it, that means that they will abandon their carts rather than reset because they're unhappy with the situation. And many, 64%, have abandoned a site due to those forgotten passwords. It does cost the actual service as well, anywhere from $5 to $30 generally to deal with these support requests. It's a big range because, of course, you have a big range of different places they can be serviced from, whether it's, let's say, in Africa, Asia, or maybe the USA, where obviously the numbers are usually very much higher. So, you know, a really sort of simple calculation, obviously, definitely not rocket science. But the idea is that your failed logins will actually mean directly lost revenues. So if you're looking at, say, 5%, your 100,000 revenues, but 5% of your people are failing to get in, of course, that means somewhere around $5,000 in lost revenues. And by the way, we do have a little website calculator there where you can compare it with some of our stuff if you just go to our website. But you can get into a lot more detail than that. So if you think about it, right, actually looking at the lost lifetime value of some of the people who hard bounce off your site means that you could potentially be leaving more than double your revenues on the table. So here in this calculation here, we're assuming 100,000 logins and 100,000 in revenues, $250 lifetime value. So that's the value you'd reasonably expect out of that your customer over the lifetime. And say it costs you around $50 to acquire that person. They've gone through about 50% of their lifetime. You've got a 5% login failure, which is not very high at all, because obviously if you talk about certain things like passwords, you're looking at anywhere up to 20%, so around 2 to 20%. And if you were looking at something like a site where it had not only that password, but an SMS OTP, then you could be adding another 15% or more to that failure rate. Here we're assuming only a quarter of those login failures turn into hard bounces. And if you remember the stat before, 64% of people have left sites because of forgotten passwords. It's unsurprising that we've seen some very large organizations where they've had up to 50% of those login failures turn into hard bounces. By hard bounces, I mean you never see them again. So what does that cost? Well, it actually costs you 1,250 lost clients, a large chunk of wasted marketing spend, but actually the most surprising thing is actually your lifetime value, which has been lost, which exceeds your actual revenue. So in other words, if you could recapture those people, you might be able to double your revenues overnight. It also makes a huge difference in the enterprise as well. Again, remember to mention the idea that 30 seconds adds up. Well, here's an actual calculation for you. And I should say, by the way, in that previous calculation and this calculation, you can actually play around with the numbers. We do have the links there where you can actually go to a Google version and play around with the numbers yourself. But here we have the assumption of 5 logins per day for 500 employees. And we're assuming 30 seconds per login. And it's quite surprising that it seems to be that whether it's like an SMS OTP after username and password or your credentials or an authenticator app, it's still roughly 30 seconds because generally speaking, you still have to enter in your username and password. Then you have to respond to the SMS, or you have to take out your phone, create a TOTP or some other sort of thing like that. If your employees are on average working for 225 days, 8 hours a day, and their salary is around $20,000 on average with a 1.5 cost multiplier. So that means really the extra additional overhead to actually keep them in their job. We're looking at a loss of $156 per employee. So what we're looking at is the time that they've lost over the course of that working year, $156 per employee. So that's around $78,000 per year for that enterprise, or nearly 3 staff years lost. So what that means, if you think about it, of your 500 employees, essentially you could consider 3 of them are just dedicated to logging people in. So you've lost all of that. So of course, the big thing is the fact that a lot of people consider multi-factor authentication doesn't work. And generally speaking, we'd agree with that. Because if you think about it, multi-factor authentication has been available since the very early days of the internet. In fact, actually, it's been available before then, before the internet. But really, the adoption rates are very, very low, sort of around 5% in total. And the big question is, why is that? Obviously, there are a whole bunch of different reasons, but we can probably put them into sort of three sort of primary categories. We think it's due to the complexity of the solution, the deployment issues, or the operability issues, and obviously the expense of those solutions. So looking at something like user complexity, typical multi-factor involves the entry of the username and password followed by a second step. And in fact, if you look at something like SMS OTPs, which are roughly 60 to 70% of all strong authentications that take place, it is always a situation where you enter your username and password, then you basically wait for that OTP to come in, which you then type into another field to complete your authentication. So if you look at that, that actually has a number of different discrete steps. We're talking about a half a dozen discrete steps. Each one of those steps, of course, is a point of failure. Something where the user could possibly fail, or maybe your systems are failing, because of course, using that sort of framework, you're also reliant on your cellular network. Now, for something like your employee traveling around, let's say in Africa, of course, I'm sure you've all had the situations where OTPs simply are not possible. They don't have the telecoms agreements to be able to get that delivery of that OTP to you. So you just got to sit tight and wait till you're into a better area of coverage. So what that sort of translates into is failure. And again, going back to the sort of numbers that we typically see, even the telecoms companies would actually generally agree that's on the A2P messaging, so application messaging, they would suggest around a 15% failure rate is quite normal. So that's on top of your username and password failure rate. So reasonably speaking, if your username and password's 2 to 20% and your OTP's failure rate is 15%, we're looking at a failure rate of 20% or more. Of course, that's not going to be acceptable to the consumer at all. Remember, the consumers really want to hit a site. They just want to get in. They want to get in now. And of course, for your employees, it's also not going to be acceptable, because when they can't log in, they can't work. Deployment is, again, historically been a real big issue. And by deployment, I don't mean just the idea of being able to get the infrastructure in place. I also mean your endpoints as well. Because if you think about a lot of solutions today, they involve an authenticator app or something similar, which has to be installed on a certain type of machine at a certain operating system level, so iOS level X or Android level Y. And if you don't meet those requirements, of course, you're not going to be able to run the authenticator app itself. Now, in the enterprise, that's perfectly acceptable. You've got a lot more control. You also have the option of actually handing out handsets which meet those requirements to your employees. But if you look at something like the consumer space, how's that going to work? So really, when we look at most sort of options, it comes back down to the easiest, most ubiquitous service out there is actually that SMS OTP. Of course, it has that huge failure rate and high complexity. And if you look at other solutions, like as an example, authenticator apps, well, unsurprisingly, when we talk about the voluntary take-up of multi-factor in the consumer space being only around, say, 2 to 4%, then actually the authenticator apps, generally speaking, are far less than that. So they're a small fraction of that. Authenticator apps really are the choice of more technical people rather than your average consumer. So the net result is, of course, that people just simply do not use them. So the last point here about why multi-factor authentication just generally doesn't work in the real world is that it's also expensive. If you're reliant on, as an example, SMS OTPs, in some areas of Europe, they can be as high as 10 euro cents. And of course, in some areas of Africa, especially if you're dealing with some of the main telecoms provider cross-country, then you could be looking at 20 cents or more. Now, that's, of course, just for something as simple as an SMS passcode being sent. But now if you look at some of the other solutions, as an example, biometrics or let's say, again, the authenticator apps, things like that, you're talking about centralized systems, which can often cost in terms of $1 per user, if not more. As an example, and I'm not going to knock on any particular provider, some IAM solutions, they'll typically charge you another $5 or $6 per month per user if you choose to use some of their multi-factor options. So this sort of gets to the point of why we're here. this is the plug, of course, but really what I want to do is after this actually show you these solutions in action, so you can actually see that none of these claims are in any way exaggerated. So MIRACL Trust, or MIRACL, the company I work with, has MIRACL Trust, which addresses a lot of these issues. The reason why is because we basically turn the entire authentication process into a single step operation requiring only the entry of a 4-digit PIN. And that can be done on any device. So what that means is that if you are accessing from your mobile phone's browser or from your desktop's browser, we don't care if it's, let's say, something like Firefox or Chrome or anything like that, it will operate with those browsers without any sort of issue whatsoever. It also can be embedded in any sort of a native application. So if you have a service app, we can embed it can embed the MIRACL Trust, the authentication service. And of course, what that means is we're now delivering that service via the same channel that you are delivering your underlying service. So what we promise is to have 100% availability on 100% of devices for 100% of people. So what we're doing is we're addressing the sort of issues that you typically sort of see. We're making it extremely, extremely fast. And by simplifying the process down to a single step, what we're doing is we're cutting out all the additional points of failure. So we've seen some of the highest success rates in the world. In a B2B engagement we've seen 99.997% success rate, which means that only about 1 in every 40,000 authentications required a reset. In the consumer space, in Africa, we've seen as high as 99.93%, meaning only about 1 in every 1,300 authentications requires a reset or of the PIN or a resetting of the device, which exceeds by a long margin anything we've seen actually in any sort of literature or elsewhere. We're providing this service on a per use basis as well, and we're charging less than the cost of an SMS text message because we see that as actually one of the primary forms of authentication that we want to displace. It can be integrated directly into any sort of cloud service, or you can also take this via our own IAM platform, which has it integrated already. In any case, with that, let's see, I'd like to see if there are any questions you guys have, happy to answer them. But what I'm going to probably do now is I'm just going to show you a few of the systems and how the MIRACL multi-factor works. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, it's a single step process, and what you'll see here is a web service. So this is obviously on the consumer sort of end. It's already been set up. So I'm just taking you through the login process. Now only 4 actual user journeys are required to go completely passwordless. The first one is obviously the login. I hit login, I type in my PIN, and that's it. Now, it's worthwhile noting that not only was that very fast, and I'll do it again, but it also meets European standards for strong customer authentication, meaning it's multi-factor authentication. And I think the vast majority are going to sit out there and say, how the heck is that multi-factor? Because of course, all I've done as a user is enter in my PIN. But what you'll see is the fact that when I hit login, my identity has already been established in this browser. In other words, what I did was I chose a PIN for this browser, this specific browser. And I can only enter that PIN in this browser. So my PIN is 1245. Yeah. And I'll put this, I'm going to put this thing into the chat, the URL. So you guys, if you'd like to, you can also play around with it. So what you see then is I have to enter my knowledge factor into a device which has been set up. In other words, that device has to be present as well. So that's my possession factor. So it's a knowledge factor coupled with a possession factor, and that completes the login. So again, very simple. And we're done. We can also authenticate actions as well. So let's say there's a high value action taking place. The best thing is to re-authenticate the users. And at this stage, we're getting about a 99.99% success rate because the user is also using exactly the same PIN they selected to do the login originally. That is, I'm going to log out, log in, and I'm going to delete my account this time. Now that's only a demo feature, just simply so we can start afresh. And what I'm going to do is show you how easy this is to set up. Of course, this is for a sort of consumer site, but what we want to do is get the user enrolled and choose our PIN. So this web form would be the services, in other words, MIRACL's clients form. We do not mandate or dictate any of the items that need to be collected. The only thing that needs to be collected is an ID, a claimed ID, and a PIN. Well, you know, I'm actually very happy to show you the PIN that I use, 1245, and I've also given you the URL to the demo. Feel free to try, if you'd like, to enter in as me, and you won't be able to, of course, because you haven't been able to enroll. In this case, what we're doing for enrollment is we're simply registering. This is on a declaration of the information, and we're allowing the user to set up the PIN in the first instance. Later on, of course, once the account's set up, we need to actually prove that it's actually the same user, so we need to verify them at some point. So here, my ID, a few details on the registration form, register, and that's the entire process completed. So what you note for the user is the user was never even aware that they were actually setting up multi-factor, and in fact, all they did was go through a standard registration form. But when they now log out and log back in again, they can use their PIN. So extremely easy to set up. So the question then might be, well, so what happens if I want to go to a new system and log in? Here we have a new system, and what I'm going to do is show you what happens if you try and hit login in a new system. You'll see that actually there's no PIN pad. There's no ability to actually even use the information which you might have learned from me. Say you'd fish the fact that I use 1245 and my ID is demo@miracle.com. There's nowhere to enter that sort of thing. The only thing you can do if you're trying to log in, well, other than signing up, of course, is you have to basically be able to verify that it's you to be able to set this device up. Now, in this one, what we're using is a very sort of simple email verification with an SMS, or sorry, with an email passcode. So when I hit next, we'll receive an email. Which I type in, and that allows me now to choose my PIN. So you can see I'm still using the same PIN again. And that's it. That's completed the whole process to setting up a new device. And again, note the user did not actually was not necessarily even aware that they were enrolling a device. They were asked to do some fairly standard things, because that first step was essentially saying what your username is, something they do every time they type in a username or password. Instead, they're just putting in their username, in this case, an email address. The second step was just to type in an OTP, which is often done. And then finally, they could choose their PIN. So there's no concept necessarily of actually enrolling the device itself. So what you see then, we've managed to do a login. We've done a sort of an enrollment and registration all in one step. And we've also done enrolling a new device with a PIN. Now, there's only one other thing that's required to go completely passwordless in a system like this. And that is, what happens if somebody forgets their PIN? Okay, I forget my PIN. Already, I've been sent that passcode, because remember, on this device, we already had the ID established, so we already knew who to actually initiate that verification flow, that reset flow with. So here, I can look at my new passcode, enter that in, go next, and I go enter in my PIN, yet again, choosing exactly the same thing. So here we go. Next on that, and of course, I've reset. So I've done 4 user journeys, which basically complete the ability to actually go completely passwordless. That is using the registration and enrollment, login flow, the PIN reset, and also the the adding a new device as well. All right. So now there's one other thing I'd like to show you here. All right. So now I'm going to go into something else. So this is more for the concept of the enterprise. So we actually have 2 different forms of SSO which we provide. One of which is a full IAM platform, which uses obviously MIRACL's multi-factor. Then the other one is it's a completely sort of on-prem containerized privacy-centric version of SSO, which doesn't even have a database. Both of them essentially do very similar sort of things, as you can imagine. So here on the MIRACL one, this is the full IAM. I type in my PIN. I'm presented with the various different options that I have. Any sort of further action on the part of the user. So as you can see, extremely easy. Here the Office 365 domain has been federated to MIRACL, meaning that pretty much everybody uses exactly the same method to log in. So if I sign out of that again, yeah, you can see, trouble signing me out, probably because I'm still logged into the SSO. But in any case, we can support pretty much any applications that you want via this one. The other one we have is what we call the simple single sign-on. And the reason why is because, as I mentioned, it doesn't actually have any database. So there's no database or repository of your users. So it's absolutely privacy centric. And in this case, what happens is it connects into something like a Zero Active Directory to read all the sort of the typical LDAP information and then provision the user with whatever access they need. So here, type in my PIN, and this is the one that I use every morning at MIRACL. And what you can sort of see is exactly the same sort of thing happens there. So go to GitLab as an example, and I'm sort of logged straight in without any issues at all. Well, with that, I think I've pretty much covered most things. Really wanted to open it to any questions that people might have.
Hi, Michael. If I may show something as well.
Yep.
On how we've actually integrated your solution into one of our systems.
Okay. Yep.
I'm going to quickly share my screen here.
Mm-hmm.
And because we are using what we call the OpenText or NetIQ Advanced Authentication Framework, and the system that I'm going to log on to now is our Retain Archive system. Okay. So if I click here on login, I am now being presented with various chains I can use, and MIRACL is one of them that I can actually use. So I can say next, and you'll notice it pops it up. And let me quickly, I'm not going to show anyone my PIN. And you can see it logs me into the system. And this is now a real live system. It's not just a demo system.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's great to see that in action. So I suppose, yeah, it would make sense to mention that if anybody likes, I can hand over my presentation mostly for the links in there, because there are links to various different things, calculators. As an example, the ROI calculators for the enterprise, also for services. And happy to engage with people, further questions, demonstrations, or anything they'd like. No problems at all. And I'm sure you have the details there. You can pass those on.
Oh, yes, we most definitely will be doing so. But okay. Thank you very much. I think it was quite an informative
Cheers.
presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Cheers. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.